Hello, and welcome to the Cape Coffee Beans podcast. My name is Faden, and I'm the founder of Cape Coffee Beans, South Africa's leading retailer in the specialty coffee space. We sell everything you need to make an amazing cup of coffee at home, at the office, in the cafe, or even on the road, including equipment, accessories, and artisan roasted coffee beans, both online and in store at our headquarters in Claremont, Cape Town. This podcast is a deep dive into the world of South African specialty coffee with a focus on the brands, the businesses, and the people in the local coffee scene, many of whom I'm privileged to work with. I'll be bringing you interviews with many of these South African coffee heroes, so please do subscribe to the podcast and share it with your coffee loving friends. Thank you for your support. Now let's get to today's episode. Hello, coffee lovers. In today's episode, you are in for a treat and for something different. This is our first episode after I've finished interviewing all the roasters that we worked with. As some of you might know, this podcast was born during the height of the South African coronavirus related lockdown. And at the time, the idea was to shine the spotlight, particularly on the coffee roasters and coffee businesses that we work with. But things are winding down a little bit now in terms of the lockdown, thankfully. And I've interviewed all those roasters, and those were great episodes, I think, and ones that I hope that you enjoyed. But I'm looking to continue this podcast, and now we're going to try doing some different things. And one of the first things that I wanted to do was start to interview professionals from other parts of the coffee space. And I guess there was no more obvious choice than going to Winston Thomas, 3 times South African Barista Champion. He was requested by many people as a guest. And so it's an interesting opportunity to get to know the career of somebody different, somebody who didn't start with a business that was roasting coffee. I also think that it was an interesting opportunity to dive into Winston's tips for both home brewers and baristas about how to brew specialty coffee at home. I know that that's another thing that a lot of listeners wanted to hear more of. This really was a great episode. I really enjoyed chatting to Winston, and I think he has an incredible story in that in a handful of years he went from not knowing much about coffee to being 3 times South African Barista Champion. I really think you'll enjoy hearing about all the steps on that journey. So without further ado, here is Winston Thomas. Winston, welcome to the Cape Coffee Beans podcast.
Hey, Faden, how's it going?
Good. How are you?
No, I'm chilled. No complaints. No complaints.
Winston, even though you are not one of our coffee roasters, I reckon that you were probably the most requested guest on this podcast as soon as I kicked it off. So I'm glad that we're finally getting to chat this way.
It's good to be on the show, Faden. It's a honor and a privilege, and this is my first ever podcast, so there's a few nerves.
Is it? Okay, that's great. That's great though. I'm glad we've got you for the first time. I'm sure it'll be the first of many. I think the podcasting thing is getting more popular. But for those who've been living under a specialty coffee rock for the last few years, you are the current South African Barista Champion. And remind me, is it the third time?
Yeah, it's the third time.
Third time South African Barista Champion, right? So I think that that's one of the main reasons that a lot of people want to chat with you. But I think that you've had an interesting and diverse coffee career, and I think a big part of today is, we want to share a little bit of that story with everyone, but also get your perspectives on, things about coffee, because I think people are intrigued to hear different perspectives. Up until now, I've only been chatting with roasters. But before we get into all the coffee stuff, Winston, I'd love to start with a little bit about your background. And I must admit that, I don't know a lot about what you were doing before you got into the coffee space. Where did you come from? Where did you grow up? How did you get started on your career before coffee?
Yeah, so I'm from Cape Town, but I'm from a small town outside of the city called Strand, and fairly small community. We've got everything we need in Strand as far as a beach, schools nearby, mall goes. So spent all my life in Strand in the same house, and I didn't know what I wanted to do after school. I had this idea of being a DJ and a music producer. And so I decided to take a gap year after school. And I was working in a Clicks for a couple of months, just as like a shelf packer. And my dad and my brother both work in construction, and the company that they worked for, they were looking for someone to do sort of like IT admin related work. So I went for the interview and I got the job. And because I had the right subjects in school, they saw an opportunity for me to go and study civil engineering. And they offered me a bursary and said, look, you go and study for 3 years, and when you come back, you'll work for us for 3 years. And I didn't know what else to do, so I kind of just went with it. Um, and one of the things that I would do was in my June to July holidays, I had to go back to work. And because I helped in the tender department, I'd often go into the city um, to hand in tender documents and do like quite a few admin related things. And this was a big thing for me because I didn't spend much time outside of Strand and Altenburg. A lot of people don't know. My first time at the V&A waterfront, I was 18 years old. Um, so yeah, I had a bit of a sheltered um, life, which I really enjoyed, by the way. Really enjoyed Strand and what we done in Strand.
Hmm.
But coming into the city was just a really new experience for me. And while I was studying, there's a local newspaper in Strand called the District Mail, and
Mhm.
I used to read the newspaper quite often. And a woman had written a letter complaining that there was no good coffee in Somerset West, and this was like 2012, I think.
Uh-huh.
Um, and I couldn't understand what she was complaining about. And she said she has to drive to Stellenbosch or to the city to get good coffee. Like something needs to happen in Somerset West, and it sparked my curiosity, and it made me ask the question, well, what is good coffee? And from there, I went on to Google and I Googled best coffee in Cape Town, and the usual suspects popped up. Most of the guys that you've had on your podcast,
Mhm.
Tribe, Been There, Origin, Truth came up. And so what I started doing was I started using my Tinder document trips to the city to visit different cafes. Um, so I had a little journal where every time I went into a cafe, I'd write about my experience and what the coffee was like and stuff. But not knowing much about the industry, just enjoying the experience of drinking coffee. Um, and I dove deep into the Google world of coffee as well, and just got into a lot of videos. And I done this for about a year and a half. And at some point, I managed to save up enough money to do a barista course. Um, and Origin Coffee Roasting popped up on my radar. So in, I think like 2013, in my June, July holidays, I went to Origin and did a barista course with Bilbo. And yeah, I was just blown away by the experience. I mean, back then the barista school in Origin wasn't where it is right now, but you'd kind of be like right in the middle of packaging, roasting, and like there was a bit of chaos, but like organized chaos. And the reason why I was so taken aback by the experience is because you'd walk in through this very busy cafe, walk upstairs, and you'd be exposed to all of these coffee related things, and you'd have different people walking past and contributing to the class. And after I finished my third day of the course, I was like, you know what? I think this is what I want to do. Um, but I finished my engineering studies. I received a diploma in engineering from Cape Peninsula University of Technology, um, and that kept my parents happy. So I was like, "Here you go. I've got a qualification to fall back on," because I know most parents want that for their kids. And yeah, I was working part time at a few places, a market in the Woodstock, in the Palms Market, and the coffee roastery in Somerset West, just part time while I was studying. Um, but I like to say that my official life as a barista started at Origin in August of 2014 after I finished my studies.
Okay. Wow. Okay. I didn't realize. And so I guess it wasn't that long from your between when you got personally interested in coffee and when you decided to move in professionally. But I'm kind of curious because so you mentioned that, you when you read this thing that the lady had written in the newspaper, you didn't really know what she meant when she said that there wasn't good coffee in Strand. But then shortly afterwards, you were kind of visiting cafes and taking notes on the experience. I'm just curious. I mean, what made you think to do that? Is that how you approach a lot of things in life, or what was it that made you want to dive that deep into the topic?
I think just like there's this romanticism that you get with coffee, and I think the videos that I watched, like I used to go in Vimeo and I typed in coffee and I searched, and I would go through every single tab, and like I remember one specific video used to pop up from Stumptown Coffee Roasting in the States, and it was like this 11-minute video where they interviewed four different people who worked for Stumptown, and they'd kind of just follow them through their day.
Mm.
Um, and there was another video where they had three different roasters in the US, Blue Bottle, um, and another two roasters. And I just remember seeing, like, looking at the images of the siphons they made and the pour overs and the way the baristas were dressed and those classic shots of espresso extraction and latte art. Um, and that the imagery really captivated me. And I think when I went into the cafes, I was kind of observing what was happening in the cafe from the same lens. And I guess I just wanted to write it down. And I thought that perhaps one day those experiences would help me, I don't know, learn a bit more, or I'd look back and I'd be like, you know what, this is what coffee needs to be for me. And I guess in hindsight, I try and keep try and keep that memory intact so that I never forget what coffee used to be for me.
Mm.
Um, just so that I kind of stay on the same track. But I mean, I used to love a good chocolate mocha from the CPUT campus, and that was my favorite drink, and I believe that to be the best coffee I ever tasted. And I guess the letter that the woman wrote just made me rethink like what what is good supposed to be.
That's interesting. That's interesting. Well, I guess, that's probably a credit to you from an open-mindedness perspective, right? Because a lot of people would not look at that and think that maybe they're missing something. I think a lot of people do that in coffee, right? They kind of, if somebody suggests that something is better, they say, ah, nah, my favorite coffee is my favorite coffee, and that's it. But
Yeah, of course.
yeah, but that's interesting that that sparked that interest. And what made you do the professional barista course right away? Did you know that you wanted to go and do barista work, or was it just for interest value?
No, interest value. I think that holiday, I had a bucket list of things that I wanted to do, and at the time, I was trying a lot of new things. So I just started playing the guitar. I just started surfing, and I think two of the other things on my bucket list for that holiday was to finish two books that I was reading and to climb or hike up three mountains or something like that. So I guess I just set out a very ambitious to-do list for the holiday. Um, and there was no intention of thinking that I'd one day want to be a barista. I think I'd managed to save up enough money, and the Origin course looked really intriguing. And so I thought, you know what, let's just see what this thing is about. At that point, I'm really fascinated by the city or the CBD and just walking around. And I thought that this barista course might be an interesting thing. Let's just see where it goes.
Fantastic. And you were trained by one of the original legends at Origin, Bilbo, right? I did a home
Yes, of
barista course
course.
with Bilbo around the same time. I didn't do the professional one, but I did the home barista course. I think maybe I did mine in 2013. But okay, so you joined Origin, you said late 2014.
Yeah, August. I remember to the day because I first went in my last day of training. So I had like 3 or 4 days of training. And my last day was on my birthday. It was a Thursday, and I remember leaving the cafe. And George and Lovejoy were standing outside. Lovejoy was having a cigarette, and they said, "Hey, Winston, good week of training. We'll see you next week for your first official day. Where are you off to?" And I said, "No, it's my birthday. I'm just going out into the city first Thursdays." I made a bit of a big deal that it was my birthday and I should have told him. But I remember that moment. So I kind of track back and I know that the 7th of August was my last day of training. And that's more or less when I started in coffee. So I guess that was a week or two ago. So I've officially been in coffee for 6 years.
Right. Right. And so I was often visiting Origin HQ around that time, doing cuppings with Mike McDonald. I remember the the days when Lovejoy was still there. And I kind of vaguely remember around that time when you were, one of the newer baristas. But I think I remember Mike talking about you and the fact that, I think that you made an impression there relatively quickly. Um, you obviously took to coffee very quickly, and you showed your talent as a barista very quickly. What what do you think allowed that to happen? Because obviously Origin trains a lot of very talented baristas, but it does seem that from early days, at least other people were telling me that you stood out. What do you think contributed to that?
I I think there was a obviously an interest, and there was a strong curiosity for it. Um, but I think it for me it ticked a lot of boxes. So I mean, I really like people. Um, I like problem solving. Like I really used to enjoy maths at school. I wasn't the best at maths, but I enjoyed solving a good problem. I enjoy working with my hands. I really like sport. Um, and I'm naturally curious, and I like new experiences. And I think coffee was kind of all of that in one. So I
Mm,
mean, making like I used to be so dirty in the beginning, like my apron would be covered in coffee grounds. But I loved getting things dirty. I loved the challenge of learning how to do latte art, um, learning how to dial in espresso, tweaking recipes, tasting coffee. And I mean, for me, it was like a playground. And I think a couple of months into it, I can't remember who I told, but I said, like, I can't believe that I'm getting paid to do this every day. And I mean, I was driving in from Strand. So the daily routine was wake up at 5, leave Strand at about 5:15, sit in an hour's traffic, get to Origin at 6:15, work till 5:30. Um, and I think one of the benefits I had was because I knew that traffic would only subside from 6 p.m. I would stick around the cafe just because I wanted to wait out traffic. So if ever there was any help needed with anything, I was always around. And then I drive home at 6, get home at about 6:45, and do the same thing the next day. Um, so I think I really enjoyed it, and I felt fortunate to be paid to do something like that every single day. Um, and I think also the romanticism of coffee that I experienced before I worked there. It's kind of like I was now living in one of the videos I used to watch.
mm,
But I think a large part of it was also the environment at Origin. I mean, just the cafe alone, they kind of encourage learning. And you've got so much at your disposal. So, I mean, I'd never get bored behind the bar, because if I didn't feel like making espresso, I could just go over to the brew bar and play around with the siphon.
mm.
Um, and if it was quiet at 3 p.m., I'd go upstairs and bug Mike and see what he's doing. Um, so there was always stuff to do, and there was always a lot to learn. And I think in coffee, like, you're never really satisfied. And I think there's always going to be a new coffee to taste, a new recipe to try out. And for me, it kind of just it kept things going. So yeah, I still feel a lot of that today. But I mean, back then as a new barista in Origin, it was just like it was just this playground, and I couldn't get enough of it.
Amazing, amazing. And how long was it before you first decided to compete?
So that's I don't. A lot of people don't know this, but I actually never decided to compete. Lovejoy decided to compete for me, or he decided that I would compete.
Okay.
Um, yeah. So my first competition was in like mid 2016, 2015, for the 2016 round of competitions. And I think when I got to Origin, I didn't know anything about barista competitions really. Um, but because Lovejoy was working there at the time, like a lot of people would come in and talk about Lovejoy, the barista champion. And I guess for anyone that works at Origin, if you stay there for long enough, eventually you'll know exactly what a barista competition is. Um, and there's a very strong and healthy barista competition culture at Origin. So I mean, naturally, as a barista working there, at some point you either will go to watch a competition or compete yourself. And I think Lovejoy asked all of the baristas for the 2015 leg when they compete. Um, and I said, I'll go back the next year. And when the 2016 leg came about, um, I I said like, no, I'll go in 2017. And he said, no, you're not going to do this again. You're not going to skip this. Um, so yeah, but I think it was really early on, because I remember about about a couple of months into working at Origin, I was packing the shelves. I was putting up tea boxes and stuff like that. And two of the guys that worked there, one was Mornay and another guy was David Bernstein. They were sitting at one of the tables, and they called me over and they sat me down, and they literally asked me, they said to me like, Winston, we see you packing these shelves here, and we've never seen anyone pack shelves with so much enthusiasm. And in my head at the time, I was thinking like, well, I got a lot of experience packing shelves at Click, so I know a thing or two. But they asked me like, why are you here? Like, what are you doing here? Because they looked through my CV and they saw I studied engineering, but like I get so excited about coffee, and I said like, well, I just want to learn about coffee and make coffee. And the second question they asked me was like, cool, when are you going to barista competitions? And I said like, well, it's a very interesting thing, and I like competing because I like sport, but like I'll see how it goes. And they said, okay, cool, but like we think you could really do well in these comps. You should go, and there's a chance that you could win. And I said, look, I want to go to barista competition, but the first time I go, the first competition I go to, I just want to go to learn. Um, and I said, the second time I go, and then I'll win the competition. And so like that was always something I wanted to do, because Lovejoy would always express like the benefits of a barista competition. He made it clear that, look, not everybody gets to win the competition, but just by going and preparing for the competition, you always come back to the bar with a new set of skills. You meet a lot of new people. So Lovejoy, to a certain extent, forced me to compete in 2016. And that was for Western Cape Regionals, yeah, which was hosted at the Good Food and Wine Show at the CTICC. Yeah, I
Hmm.
think that might have been late 2015 for the 2016 competition leg.
And how did the first competition go?
It went well. I mean, when it's your first time competing, you never really know what to expect. And at the time, I just made sure that I rehearsed my speech really well. I done a little bit of acting in school, so memorizing a couple of words and saying it on stage wasn't new to me. But the biggest challenge was making sure I don't mess up when I make the coffee.
Mm.
Um, and it went surprisingly well. I came second in the competition, just behind Wayne Oberholzer, um, and I was very shocked. And when I look back at the video, I was so serious. I wasn't smiling, and I was doing this weird thing with my hands. Um, but I was just chuffed to make it to the next round and get a chance to go to nationals. Um, and it was weird because at the time, like I was competing with people that I was still very nervous to meet. And I mean, I just remember going to Durban, and because Nationals was in Durban in 2016, and I was chatting to Bilbo, and someone else was also standing around. And Craig Charity walks up to us and starts chatting to Bilbo as well. And I completely froze, because here's the guy that had just been on the coffee magazine. I've been reading about him for years, and he's here and he's talking to me, and I still get very starstruck. Um, but nationals didn't go that well. Nationals, I think I messed up with my signature drink, and I didn't divide the drink evenly into 4 glasses. So when I got to the last glass, there was nothing left to just a bit of foam, and I just gave it to the one judge that I didn't know. So I think I came 7th or 8th, maybe even 9th at nationals in 2016. But it was a humbling experience, very humbling experience.
What was your coffee? Do you remember?
Kenya got Tahiti, Faden. I'll
Uh,
never forget it. There was two. There was, I think, nationals. I took a Kenya Gakuyuini, and then for regionals, Kenya Gakuyuini, and nationals, Kenya got Tahiti. Um, and I remember the nationals coffee like it was yesterday, because there was a moment in the cafe, and I remember Chang was sitting at the bar, and there was another guy called Roscoe sitting at the bar, and I pulled this espresso, and it was like strawberries, and I was just like, this is so amazing. And I gave it to the two of them, and I saw their eyes light up, and they were like, yeah, this is strawberries. And then I told myself like, this is the coffee I'm going to use. So yeah, like those two Kenyan coffees at Origin in 2015-16 like was so good.
Yeah, I remember Kanyagata Iti very well, actually, and we haven't had one of those for quite a while. Hopefully the guys at Origin will get another Kanyagata Iti in. But yeah, that was an amazing
Yeah,
coffee.
I agree.
Okay, and you went on to compete how many more times after that?
3 more times. So I think, look, I think stars were aligned, and I know I was very fortunate, because after losing the nationals in 2016, we then went over to the Aeropress competition, and I didn't think much of it. I had a recipe in mind, and I was really bummed at not making it to finals at nationals. But somehow I ended up winning the Aeropress competition. I had a very unique recipe, and I think that worked in my favor with the coffee that we used. So the next thing I know, I got a free plane ticket to join Wayne at WBC, and I think that played a very big part in my success in competition, because I think the only people that really get to experience it you see are those that actually win the competition.
Yeah.
That's if you're not going there to support. And for me, getting sort of a front row seat as part of Wayne's team in Dublin, I think it just gave me a lot more perspective about what goes into prepping for a barista competition at the world level. Um, and just coming back from that experience for the 2017 competition, it helped me step things up in a way that I would not have known if I didn't get the chance to go to Dublin.
Wow, what an amazing experience. I mean, you were just saying that at 18 you'd never even visited the waterfront, and then there you were in your 20s off to Ireland because of a coffee competition.
Oh, Faden. Yeah, it was absolutely insane. And I mean, like I said, to be able to stay in a house, stayed together, Team South African, it was a lot of fun, a lot of crazy adventures. But it was Wayne, Sheldon, his partner, David Coleman, John from More Flavor, and Melanie from the Coffee Mag. So I was just this kid that got this very fortunate experience to be with all the well-established professionals, and I think they just introduced me to everyone that they knew. And if you think I was starstruck at nationals in 2016, you should have seen me in Dublin. I was like, I tell some people I was like a teenage girl at a Justin Bieber concert. Um, just seeing all of these people like Colin Harmon and James Hoffman, and that's where I first saw Lem Butler compete as well. Yeah, it was crazy, insane.
Amazing. Yeah, what an experience. And if I remember correctly, that was the competition where Wayne was using the Benchmaji geisha, right?
That was the nationals. So
Oh,
he
that was the
used the
national
Benchmark
coffee.
geisha at
Yeah.
nationals, and he used the Colombian coffee, which he called Pedro. Right?
Pedro, of course. Yeah.
He had the t-shirts and stuff like that. Yeah, that was um, WBC 2016.
I remember that. It's funny because I was thinking about the fact that you went on to win a national competition with a geisha natural as well later on, right?
Yeah, that's right. So that was 2018 nationals. Yeah, 2017 I won with Origin. It was a Tanzania Peaberry. Iyenga.
Mm,
Yeah. Iyenga, Tanzania, Iyenga.
I remember that coffee well as well. So you
Yeah,
went
washed
on.
Peaberry.
You were at some point at Origin. You were also doing the training school, if I'm not mistaken, right?
Yeah, so I was a barista up until for like 2.5 years, and then became the lead barista. And everything happened because um, Bulbo had left. So Arno came down, and Arno took over from Bulbo in the Barista Academy. But then at some point, David Mansell, who did wholesale and tech, also left. So there was a position available. And at the time I said, like, look, guys, I feel like I can do a little bit more. Um, and they said, like, okay, cool. Like, because you're the barista, it might work out if you work in wholesale and sort of be a relationship manager with some of our clients, because they're pouring our coffee. So you go out there and help them pour our coffee better. And I was just getting the swing of things, going out and seeing clients. And about a month later, Arno put in his resignation for as the barista trainer. Um, so that came up, and then I thought to myself, like, if I could choose between the two, I'd much rather be a barista trainer than work in wholesale.
Mm.
Um, but we were a bit short staffed at the time. So Joel said, you know what, go and train in the barista school, and then you just keep a couple of clients on the wholesale side. Um, so yeah, it was about, I guess, like 3 years working as a barista, and then moved over to run the Barista Academy at Origin.
And obviously you competed again. I guess you won 2 of your national titles while still at Origin. Is that right?
No, the first one. So I left Origin actually very abruptly after getting back from the second competition, the first competition. So, and it was because of, I saw an opportunity, right? So for some reason the WBCs are usually in June, so it's usually mid-year every year. But for some reason, 2017 WBC in Korea was in November, and the next WBC was going to be in Amsterdam in June. So there was a very short period between the two WBCs. And shortly before I went to Seoul for WBC 2017, we had the regional competition for the 2018 leg of comp. And I decided it would be good practice, so let me compete in that one. Um, and because I'd won that competition, I could then go back to nationals in 2018.
Mm.
So because Seoul was a big disappointment for me. And after a lot of introspection in Korea, I decided, you know what, the one thing that I need to do better at this comp is time. I feel like I need to be able to dedicate a lot more time to practicing for competition. Um, and the only solution was to leave Origin and just try and do competition full time. Because there was about a 6-month period between the two comps. And I also knew that I'd be competing at the African Barista Championships in Uganda in Feb. So it worked out really well because 2 weeks before nationals, I'd be competing in Uganda in a competition. And that would be good prep for the national comp.
Mm.
So I just went all in, and I took a big gamble. I decided to resign at Origin. And because I was no longer working, I had to move out of my apartment in Woodstock. But very fortunately, I had a friend in Somerset West who was moving to Johannesburg, and he was selling his house. But because he had to leave so soon, the sale of the house would take a couple of months. And he said to me, like, "Oh, Winston, if instead of you moving back to your folks' place, why don't you just move into my house and just, take care of things up until I get it sold?" So I ended up moving into my friend's house, which was like this 3-bedroom apartment. Um, and I thought, you know what, if I can fit an espresso machine in this lounge, that would be perfect. So I reached out to a couple of people, and I managed to get a 3-group Simonelli. And Wayne gave me his tables that he used for WBC, and I got a grinder from Cold Serve. So I ended up setting up this competition practice space in the living room of this house that I was living in. So it wasn't as productive as most people would think. I tell you, like I think in my head, I had the luxury of practicing whenever I wanted to. And I also have a really bad habit of leaving things for the last minute. Um, but yeah, so I lived in this house for a couple of months in Somerset West. I wasn't eating as well as I should because I wasn't working. But just practicing for Barista Comp. And fortunately, I won nationals, and that was with the Geisha Village. And that set me to go to Amsterdam in June in 2018.
Wow, fantastic. And tell people listening, what are you doing now?
So now I'm doing training specifically, and a bit of consultation as well. I for a long time after getting back from Amsterdam, I was doing a lot of freelance work, and that was freelance barista work, freelance training and consulting. But I've formalized it now somewhat. So now I offer Specialty Coffee Association barista courses. I'm looking to get a couple of other modules under my name to teach as well. And then the consultation is just an add-on. I think there's a lot of people that beyond the training, they just want support, and they want somebody who's had experience in the industry and just need somebody to kind of bounce ideas off.
Yeah.
So I guess through my training, I build a lot of relationships with people, and that ends up being consultation. I've also worked with a couple of hotels and NGOs to set up training modules and so on and so forth. And yeah, so just training. I like to see myself as the middleman. I don't supply coffee, and I don't have a cafe. I'm just the guy in the middle that helps you get everything set up.
Yeah, and I can imagine that there is an incredible market for that out there. I mean, obviously your credentials, I'm sure, are a big help, but the reality is that a lot of the time, coffee consulting and training only comes with buying somebody's specific coffee or somebody's specific equipment, right? There's not a lot of people who do it independently, so I'm sure your clients see a lot of value in that.
Yes, for sure. And I mean, it's I can't stay neutral forever. I think there was a point where I was working with a lot of different coffees,
Hmm.
um, but definitely, I think I try and put the client first. So if they want me to do training, but they use a coffee from maybe that's not from Cape Town, I'm still open to helping them. I think for me and what I do with the training and the consultation, the more people that get into coffee and open up coffee businesses, the better, because the better my chances of getting more work in the future. So it's always just a matter of putting the client first and helping them get the best out of their coffee and their equipment.
Yeah, makes sense. So, well, let's switch gears a little bit. I know that having heard this story, people will be even more curious to hear the answer to this question. But what what coffee are you drinking at home these days, and how are you making it?
So I'm actually looking up at my shelf right now, and there's an AeroPress, a plunger, and a pour over. And I think I used to just make AeroPresses most of the time. And then I kind of switched between AeroPress and V60. I had a little Simonelli Oscar in my kitchen as well, but because my account is white, I got really frustrated at how dirty I got the space. Um, so I mean, I used to, when I felt like a flat white, I'll make myself a flat white. But right now, it's mainly V60 and AeroPress, and I sort of week to week switch between the two. And the coffee I'm drinking often changes. Right now, I'm drinking some leftover Ethiopia Ethiopia Sidamo that I used. Gerald from Rock and Roller roasted for me, and I used it in one of my training courses.
Hmm.
But drinking a lot of different coffees, I think I'm part of an Earnex program where we get sent different coffees. So every other month, I'll be getting a couple of different coffees to taste. But locally, I've made, I think before the lockdown, I bought a few bags of coffee from Rosetta, and I've had a couple of people send me coffees to just taste as well, and that's been fun. It's been a lot of fun.
Cool. Yeah, yeah. I think you always seem to have your hands on some interesting coffees, which I suppose is one of the perks of being the barista champion. Um,
A
what
lot of
tips?
samples as well. Sorry, Faden. A lot of
Yeah,
samples. So
sure,
yeah, that always goes into the kitchen coffee pantry.
sure, sure. What tips would you give to somebody who, I mean, you obviously went through this early love affair with coffee, but you decided to make a career of it. I do think that one of the things that people who are just starting to get into specialty coffee experience is they kind of feel overwhelmed, right? Like there's so much out there, so many roasters out there, so many pieces of equipment out there. I mean, we certainly have that experience of talking to people at that stage of their journey, but I'm sure people would be intrigued, as somebody who's been kind of to the pinnacle of the professional side of coffee. What tips do you give somebody who's just starting out on specialty coffee about how to explore their interest?
Um, yeah, so I guess based on my own experience, when I was getting into coffee before I started working at Origin, I bought myself an AeroPress, um, and I was not good at making an AeroPress, and I think the biggest change came after I went to Espresso Lab. um, Lydia made me an AeroPress, and I was so taken aback by the fact that when she gave me my AeroPress, she handed me a timer. And she explained the recipe and how she made it. And I was just so fascinated that like, you have a recipe to make coffee, and you use a timer. Like, what's happening here? And I bought myself a little Hario grinder on the same day and went back home. And I think I started seeing much better results when I started working with the recipe. Like I took one of my mom's kitchen scales, which right now I think there's a much bigger option of quality scales.
Yeah.
But I started writing down my recipes. So writing down how much coffee I use, writing down my brewing time, and all those kind of things. And that just helped me figure out what it is I enjoyed, and it helped me a lot more with my consistency. And I believe that you don't need the best equipment to make good coffee at home. And there's a couple of hacks that I've used. So I'd say the first thing is to work with the recipe and track how you make your coffee.
Mm-hmm.
And look, if you don't have certain things, if you don't have a scale, like the AeroPress, for example, has the numbers on the side, which helps you gauge how much water you use. You can also sort of Google the volume of a tablespoon, which is what I've done at some point. So I knew that I think a tablespoon is technically supposed to be about 13.5 grams of coffee. And even though it's not going to be as accurate as what a scale would be, at least it's some form of measurement.
Yeah.
Likewise with my kettle, because I didn't have a temperature variable kettle, I would boil my coffee or boil my water, excuse me, and then I'd flip open the top of the kettle and time it and leave it open for about 2 minutes. And that was my way of measuring the temperature in some form, so that I could achieve a level of consistency. So once I managed to figure out a recipe for coffee, like the changes were amazing. And that was not having the best equipment. I think just adding a bit more structure to the way I made the coffee made a very big difference. And then water, and this happened to me now in the lockdown as well, where I've got a water filter jug, and the filters are only supposed to last 4 weeks, but because of lockdown, we ended up going about 3 months without the filter, and we recently replaced it. And just the difference in using what was supposed to be filtered water, but because the filter itself was so old, I could taste that the tap water was, and we were basically getting tap water. The filter made an amazing difference.
Yeah.
So I guess to sum it up is work with the recipe, be consistent. If you can't invest in good tools, try and be innovative with what you've got. And then the third thing is just to use good water. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I couldn't agree more with all of that. You reminded me of a story. I remember years ago when I was just getting started with Cape Coffee Beans, being at a friend's house, and he had another friend there, and being asked to make an AeroPress. And, I asked if he had a scale. And one of these guys just proceeded to kill himself laughing about the fact that I was using a scale to make coffee, right? Like it was the most ridiculous thing. And it's one of the things that I feel people really resist. But at the same time, people know that if you want to bake a cake, you've got to follow a recipe, right? You're not going to just
Exactly.
eyeball it. But I think that people really are skeptical of this in coffee, unfortunately, and it's the most important. Like you can literally just use your kettle, that dirty old French press that's somewhere at the back of your cupboard. Everybody's got one, right? And
Of
a
course.
500 rand manual grinder. And if you just pay attention to your variables, you can make a pretty darn good cup of coffee. And
Of
and
course.
I think that that's so important. And one of the things that hurts me a little bit is we'll get Cape Coffee Beans customers who come into the store and they're buying their next coffee maker. And I ask them, do you have a scale? And they say, no, not yet. And I often am tempted to talk them out of buying another coffee maker and say, no, you need a scale first.
First it is
You need to control your variables first. But yeah, I think that's good advice. And the water thing, especially in Cape Town now, the water quality unfortunately is getting worse and worse. So that filter is more and more important, I think.
Yeah, no, of course, of course.
And so what about somebody who's thinking about getting into, professional barista work, and somebody who's thinking about doing that? Do you have any words of wisdom that you would pass on to somebody at the beginning or thinking about a barista career?
Yeah, I think to a certain extent, it's as easy as just walking through the door and showing interest. I think one big thing um, that I think if you're the one wanting to be a barista, and for employees on the other side of the bar, is just having someone that's really interested in the coffee itself.
Hmm.
I know right now jobs are hard to come by, so anyone that gets a job is fortunate. But I mean, I remember when I was the head barista at Origin, and I was given the task to sit in on the first meeting for applicants. Um, most of the people, some of the people, let's put it that way, that I hired had no coffee experience at all, but they were really enthusiastic. They wanted to learn about coffee, and they were willing to put in the work, because being a barista isn't the most glamorous thing. It's early hours. You're on your feet for most of the day. Um, and I think the only thing that gets you through that hard time is just genuinely wanting to learn more about coffee and loving coffee. Um, so I think the first thing I guess to say is to just get your priorities in check. Like,
Yeah.
um, become a barista because you love coffee, not because you love the thought or the image of being a barista. Um, and then I think just show up and work hard. Like, show your employer that you're there and you want to learn. I think people notice that. um, and yeah, just put in the hours and the hard work. I think um, it's a very competitive industry at the moment. There's a lot of baristas out there, um, but I think there's always room for more baristas who are enthusiastic and want to learn, and just genuinely want to learn about coffee and make coffee. um, so yeah, that childlike interest in coffee and passion, I think, is a big thing and a big factor for someone that wants to be a barista.
I'm so glad you said that because I think you're absolutely right. Like that often is what distinguishes an average barista from a great barista. And I just want to zero in on the fact that you're not talking about making coffee, even though that's part of it, but you're talking about having an interest in the actual coffee itself, right? Like where it came from, what makes it taste like what it tastes like, and those things. And unfortunately, there are a lot of baristas out there who might be pretty decent at making coffee, but aren't that interested in the coffee itself.
Yeah, of course, 100%. And I think the way things, I like to think that in the last 6 years that I've been working in coffee, I think our consumers are a lot more clued up with coffee right now than what consumers used to be back then. And I think um, a more informed and educated consumer needs to align with a more informed and educated barista.
Right.
Um, so I think now more than ever, cafes are looking for baristas with, yes, of course, skill and passion, but also just that interest to learn more about coffee and care about the coffee that they make and the people that they're making it for.
Absolutely. And what about somebody who's thinking of competing? Like, how would you tell somebody to get started with that? Because that obviously, I think people underestimate what a task it is to compete in a barista competition. And I haven't done it myself, but you know, somebody on my team has participated, and so I got to see a little bit more firsthand, you know, what preparation looks like. But it's a pretty mammoth undertaking. What would you say to somebody thinking about competing for the first time?
If it's possible, I'd say go and watch a barista competition
Hmm.
first,
Yeah.
um, and just see what it's like. Like, if you're able to take a peek backstage and see, that's I tell you, that's where most of the action happens, is backstage. I'd say just go to a barista competition, see what it's like, and I think for most people who are interested, the barista going to watch the competition drives you to want to do the competition even more. um, so I'd say go to the barista competition and see what it's about and talk to people. And then if you're at a point where you feel like the competition is still something you want to do, I think you need to then ask yourself the question, why do you want to compete in the barista competition? And it's something I asked myself. And I think after chatting to Lem Butler, I was just asking him for some advice on WBC and how to go about writing out my set. He also told me, like, start with the why, um, because I think as someone that's won the three competitions before, I think I've gotten this a few times where a lot of people that ask me about barista competitions ask me the wrong question. They ask me, like, what do I need to do to win? And I think I just remember my innocence in my first year of comp, going to the comp because I wanted to learn and I wanted to meet people and I wanted to grow. Um, I know that when I started, that was my first intention, just to do that in my first year. And I think there's a lot in having that expectation. I think if you're going into the competition with the expectation to win, like the odds are stacked against you, because out of everyone that competes, only one person walks away with the title. So it can be quite savage at times. And I think that it's important to understand why you're going there. So um, if you don't end up winning the competition, at least you walk away either with more experience, with better insight, with better skills, or with a bigger network in coffee. So I'd say first go in and try and be a spectator at the competition, or try and help someone backstage. Even if you're polishing someone's cup, there's so much you can learn. And then if you feel like it's still something you want to do, ask yourself why you want to do it, and develop clear goals for yourself other than just winning the competition. Because I think there's definitely a lot of value in barista competitions. But I think you'll only walk away with that value if your intentions um, are beyond just winning the competition. And it's easy for me to say because I've won it 3 times before, but I've also done horribly at, like I said, nationals in 2016, my Africa Barista Championships in 2018 in Uganda was an absolute dog show. And most people don't know this because um, there wasn't a lot of social media and things at Africa in Uganda, but I came third in the comp. I knocked over one of the judges, milk drinks. So as much as I've won quite a few competitions, I've also had very bad and humbling experiences. But I wouldn't change it because I just like the competition in general, whether I'm competing or not.
That's good advice. That's good advice. And I do think it's probably fair to say that it's probably one of the most unlikely things in the world that you would go and compete for the first time and win a national competition, right? I mean, I don't know if anybody's ever done that historically, but I reckon I would bet a lot of money that that would never happen. So at least the first time you compete, you've got to be doing it for something else.
Yeah, of course, definitely.
And let's refocus on South Africa as we come to a close here, Winston. You obviously have your finger on the pulse of a lot of what's going on in the coffee space because you are independent. You work with a lot of different businesses. What do you think the future holds for specialty coffee in South Africa?
Um, this is something that I kind of I had on my mind. I think from when I was a barista working at Origin, and even when I worked for Rosetta in a short time that I did as a part-time barista. I always found in conversation with customers, people were talking more and more about having specialty coffee be more accessible,
Hmm.
and by that I think it meant being able to walk over to a cafe and have access to specialty coffee, not have to drive into the city or to Woodstock.
Hmm.
Um, and so basically coffee moving into the suburbs. And I think that's, in a way, that's what you've done with Cape Coffee Beans, is you've made coffee accessible in the suburbs for home consumers. But with the lockdown now, I think even more so, I believe that cafes, because around 2015, working as a barista, over the weekends, we had so many people from the northern suburbs um, come in on weekends and talk about how they'd love to have that same experience closer to home. And I think, I'm not sure about the northern suburbs, but I can speak on behalf of Somerset West, where when when I was looking for work as a barista, there was only one roastery I could work for. Now I think there's about 4 to 6 different roasteries in Somerset West alone. Um, so I think we're definitely moving into cafes and roasteries being more accessible, especially because of the virus. I think right now most folks are looking to operate at low operating costs with mobile setups and stuff like that.
Hmm.
Um, so I think coffee is moving beyond the city, um, which is exciting. But I think with that also comes an expectation from the consumer for that coffee to be of a certain quality.
Hmm.
Um, so yeah, I think the only thing that I'm certain of right now and what I foresee is a lot more cafes and roasteries opening up beyond the city. I think in the last 2 weeks alone, I've gotten a couple of calls and done some training as well with folks in like Cedar and Wellington and Paul. So even those areas are really being sparked now with interest in opening cafes with local coffee brands, and even a lot of talks of opening up roasteries and stuff like that.
Yeah. Well, that's cool to hear. I mean, as a coffee drinker, I find it very reassuring that you think that's happening, and I do think it's badly needed because I mean, here in Cape Town, I think we're in a world-class coffee city. But you're right, it's very concentrated in the City Bowl and Woodstock, right? And it's there's a lot of coffee around, but it's not all of the caliber that you and I enjoy. And
Yeah, and
go
yeah,
ahead.
go for it. You go for it, Faden.
Well, I was just going to
I
say that
was
we come into contact with a lot of coffee entrepreneurs at Cape Coffee Beans. One of the things that we do is we help coffee entrepreneurs get set up with their equipment. But it is one of the things that saddens me slightly is that very often the conversation is all about the equipment and it's not so much about the coffee. And I reckon you've put out good advice there, right? Which is that if you want to do something to differentiate yourself in the coffee space, do your mobile setup, do your kind of small scale, more budget oriented business, but put out a really good coffee.
Yeah, I think that's what it comes down to at the end of the day. What I wanted to say was I spoke to um, uh, someone who's based in Australia, South African based in Australia, and I just asked him what are things like during the lockdown, and he said no, like my local is still open, and I can still get my flat white or my beans from my local. And I was like, what's your local? He's like, no, like there's a couple of blocks away from my house in the suburbs, there's this cafe. And he said that's very common in Australia. And I know we years and years away from or behind Australia, but I just like the concept of like my local. It sounds so amazing. But I
Mhm.
think with having a local coffee shop like that, wouldn't it be amazing if the quality of that local coffee was also amazing? Not that it's not in the suburbs, but to have that kind of consistency where what you find in the suburbs is equally as good as what you could find at the best specialty coffee cafes in the city. And I think that's the direction we're moving into. I think information's a lot more accessible, equipment's a lot more accessible, and I'm hoping that that evolves into better quality coffee being a bit more accessible.
Yeah, I think it's a good call to action for the coffee businesses that already exist in these suburbs as well. Like, don't just do your espresso blend. Get a single origin, get a second grinder. It's not going to be that big of an investment. Have something else to offer other than, one of the 5 or 6 espresso blends that 80% of the city already serves.
Yeah, 100%. So like I said, with information and so much being more accessible, um, I think there's a lot more for up and coming cafes and roasters to play around with. Um, and yeah, I think the roasteries in the city have definitely set the standard, and I think that plays such a big part because I think before I got the opportunity to travel, as much as I love the coffee in Cape Town, I always thought that um, we are kind of small fish in a big pond, and thinking that we I'm thinking back to the coffee videos I saw, and I guess I was guilty of putting all these cafes and roasteries overseas on a pedestal. And when I got to the point of traveling and visiting these cafes, the coffee wasn't bad at all, but it was as good as what we could find in Cape Town. So coming back, then I realized, like, you know what these pioneers in coffee are doing is actually a lot bigger than what I thought, because the coffee in Cape Town and now in other cities in South Africa as well is as good as anywhere you find in the world. And I think when we're working with that kind of standard, I think cafes that move out into the suburbs and roasters that start up in the suburbs have really good have a good benchmark to work with. And a friend of mine who has a up and coming roastery, I know that he buys coffee from places like Rosetta to cup next to his coffees, so that he can compare what he's doing and the progress he's making with someone that's been doing it for many years before.
Yeah. Well, Winston, I think that that's an inspiring message to end on, and I hope your vision of the future is the right one. I would love to see the coffee industry move more in that direction, and I want to thank you also for sharing your story. I think it's pretty inspiring for anybody who's interested in working in the coffee industry. In closing, could you just tell people if they're listening to this podcast and they want to work with you, they want you to come and do some training or help them with their coffee setup, how do they get a hold of you?
Winston Douglas Coffee. So there's my personal Instagram and Facebook, but you can also find Winston Douglas Coffee on Facebook and on Instagram. And website will be up and running hopefully in the next few weeks. But you can always just drop me a mail at winston@winstondouglascoffee.com. And yeah, let's have a conversation. And I'd also like to take the opportunity to thank you, Faden, for what you've done, because I think Cape Coffee Beans has played a very big and also very unique role in where Cape Town finds itself in coffee right now, beyond the cafe. So I'll take the opportunity to thank you as well, Faden.
I appreciate that. Thank you, Winston. It's been fun to work on some things over the years, and hopefully we'll find some more opportunities over the coming years.
No, definitely. It's been a lot of fun.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Winston.
Thanks, Mr. G.
Well, that was Winston Thomas, the South African coffee legend. I really enjoyed having that chat with Winston because I must admit, I didn't know about the early days of Winston in the coffee industry. And what really impressed me was the fact that Winston obviously came from very humble coffee beginnings. He wasn't somebody who had a lifelong interest in coffee before, and he just very quickly rose to prominence in the coffee scene and clearly through a lot of hard work and dedication. And I think that that's incredibly impressive. So if you are in the coffee business and are looking for somebody to consult with, I would definitely encourage you to work with Winston. For those of you who are regular listeners to the podcast, this is, as I mentioned at the beginning, the first of a new series of episodes where I'm going to try to do some different things, look at some different topics, and talk to other personalities in the coffee industry. As always, I would encourage you to give your feedback by emailing podcast@capecoffeebeans.co.za or posting on social media channels. We already have some other interesting episodes lined up, so please do continue to listen. Please do continue to support us. Subscribe on your favorite podcast listening platform. Leave us a review if you're so inclined. And please share the podcast with your coffee loving friends. Thanks very much and happy brewing.